Hi guys, it's Chess Learning for Life here, back with another video. So this video would be mostly about the Queen's Gambit, and it also talks about some other lines of the Queen's opening, including the Horwitz defense, the Nimso Indian, and the modern King's Indian defense. So let's start off with the basic Queen's Gambit, which is after d4, d5, you would go c4, giving up a pawn. So let's firstly take a look at if they accept this gambit. So after accepting, there are two lines of e4 of just taking the center. And the line I prefer is e3. This supports this pawn, rock solid, and then gets the bishop out. So let's see if black wants to protect it with b5. You use a4 to undermine it, and he can't protect it with a6 because you can just take, and if he takes back, the rook is hanging. Consequently, he also cannot go c6 because after takes, there's a queen f3, and this rook is lost unless you give up maybe a bishop for it, but it's just lost. This rook is lost. So this is a trap, which if you went e4, there wouldn't have been this trap. Let's look at how they could also defend it with bishop e6. This is very passive, but it works. So we just keep on developing here, nothing special. We don't really mind about him having this pawn advantage because we could definitely earn it back because it's a double pawn and it does not look good for them. Or if you want to, you could already go queen a4 here, but this is not really preferred because after this there is b5, which you lose this bishop. So this is basically the accepted variation. Sometimes you don't want a tunnel vision about winning back the pawn, and you just want to kind of develop your pieces, and then later in the middle game you can earn back the pawn. And if he protects with b5, just remember this a4 move, which sets up traps. And I would like to talk about, some people would want to defend it with the bishop. It's fine, we let them take and then play a knight up. And if they're still stubborn for their pawn advantage, here remember this move b3. If he takes, you take with the knight, give this check, and then you don't take back yet, you go knight f3 and wait for when this bishop develops. You go for the pinned knight, because after they castle, this attacks the queen, and the queen has to stay defending the bishop. But after takes, there's this skewer bishop a3. So this is just like showing you not to worry about losing a pawn if they accept it. But now let's look at how they could decline the gambit. e6, the Queen's Gambit decline, is it's the main move in all three levels. And after this, just go knight c3, knight c6, and then there's this bishop pin, and there's two main moves, which is bishop e7 or bishop b4. So if he goes bishop b4, there is absolutely nothing special, just remember. Okay, so this setup is basically, after this knight c3, bishop g5, or sometimes bishop d2 pinning, unpinning, because the knight won't go to f6, and then knight hops to f3, e3, and then sometimes you take and then you go bishop d3. So this is basically the whole setup for the Queen's Gambit decline, so you don't actually need to memorize anything. After castles, develop the knight, and then a main idea. Sometimes people would like to fianchetto the bishop like this. Now you don't need to worry. Now always look for an opportunity to release the tension and take on d5. There's knight takes, and then bishop takes, maybe queen takes. There's just a series of trades here, or like just a pawn take. And as you can see, top engine move, bishop d3. This bishop likes this diagonal. And after fianchetto bishop and castle, there's knight bd7, and they're always looking to push for c5, the pawn break. So you need to anticipate for the open file, placing the rook on c1. This is also a very this is a very common move for the Queen's Gambit decline. And as you can see, c5, you shouldn't panic for it. Like, a lot of people panic after the move c5, including me, but you could just do normal development, like bishop f5, or just maybe anticipate c4. You can move the bishop back and then create a battery here or here. Like, this could also be sometimes a move. Like, bishop back to b1 is always a very strong move as it targets this diagonal. But yeah, game goes on. It's the middle game, and a very good idea is maybe to, after this, maybe there is some minority attacks here, but because they have the pawn majority here, you should always focus on getting counterplay on the king side or the center. So this is the Queen's Gambit declined. And then there's the Slav defense, which is also very popular, which I personally would play the exchange variation and the knight c3. So the top engine move is actually knight c6, which after this, both sides just develop their pieces normally. And then sometimes I like to play a3, sometimes I don't. Like maybe here, just everything could be symmetrical, except if this happens, you could just hop the knight in. Or like just some typical moves. Here you could even take, because this pawn is a very backward pawn, and queen a4 just targets it immediately. Just these are just all the normal developing moves if black doesn't fall for the trap. So now I'll talk about what is the trap. So after knight f6, which a lot of people would play, I would play bishop f4. So here if he goes knight c6, being lame, then like just like the previous variation, you just develop everything like normal. But if he goes bishop f5, remember a critical move is queen b3. This simultaneously targets this pawn, which there are two defenders already. but it also targets this b7 pawn. If you protect with the queen like this, a very good move is sacking the pawn to gain a tempo, because if you take, I can take the knight, so therefore I can pin the queen. Remember, this is very creative idea, is to give up the pawn, take the knight, because this queen would be pinned. So the best move here is actually to double his own pawn to open the rook file with queen b6. After takes, remember this move knight b5. This forces knight a6 to block this. And then a very prophylactic move is just a simple a3, just preventing any of these ideas and any bishop checks which you have to use the knight to block back. So game goes on after e6, and then rook c1, just getting the open file, and then bishop develops, e3, castles, and then remember this critical move. You have to go bishop d6 here. You can't just develop your knight, because here comes his rook, and you're one move away from castling. But remember, this bishop d6 move would prevent rook coming to c8 because it loses a bishop, and therefore it forces takes. And after this c8 square is controlled, so no rook come here. So maybe something like targeting this knight wouldn't work because this pawn hangs. And after takes, this knight is hanging. So just remember this very critical bishop d6, which does not blunder your advantage away. So there is another very annoying variation, which is the semi-Slav. Is just very annoying, which at this point you just have to play rock solid with like this same setup. Just rock solid with the same old setup. With, you could push for c5 here. I'll normally don't take and just play bishop d3 and wait for him to take. And yeah, this is just very solid, and people who play the semi-Slav is just going for a draw for black. So yep, you don't really want to spice things up in the semi-Slav because it would just create trouble for yourself. And there's this very weird, I would consider a weird move of knight f6 to protect this pawn, because after this trade there's this e4 and you control all these squares. There's two main moves, is coming back to f6, and if he tries to develop naturally, there's this d5 and then very aggressive f4 and then e5, and this is just, after knight of 3, this is just horrendous. Like, horrendous is an understatement. Like, look at this. This although we don't have any piece advantage, is already very winning, +3. And therefore here people would just develop naturally like this. We don't care about the pin. we need to protect this pawn, and after like castles, yeah, if he castles, it is actually a blunder. I almost forgot about this. Because after e5 and knight hopping here, there's a Greek gift. After a Greek gift, if he goes to g6, there's h4 and h5 is coming. So remember, there's a Greek gift sacrificial line here. And that is about it about the Queen's Gambit. Now let's talk about the Nimzo Indian. After these series of moves, you go knight c3 and is not scared about this pin. Now a very modern and also is actually classical. It's called the classical variation. It's this Queen c2. It's brought back the hype lately in these years because it's a very quick move to prevent knight e4, and after maybe castles, there's this very strong e4 push, just gaining the whole center. So therefore, d5 is a very top move, or there's a sideline of c5. So let's firstly talk about d5, which I would just unpin it and just c5 here. So Engine is trying to prove me wrong by unpinning myself, and it actually likes after c takes, because after queen takes, the queen is questionable after knight f3 and then maybe castles and unpinning. And then knight takes doesn't work because of this e4 gaining this whole center, and after knight takes, pawn takes, this supports the center. After this, there is knight f3. I protect this pawn because this pawn is pinned. And yeah, so there is also c5, which I would just immediately take and leave him with the choice of taking right away or delay taking. Normally they would castle and delay taking, which it's just normal development for queen's pawn opening. You don't need to remember like those crazy sharp lines. It's just normal a systematic development. Like that's why a lot of people like the London, which I won't talk about today because I am not a London player. I just prefer like the c4, this Queen's Gambit push. And just remember, d4 line is a very, you need to be very patient about your middle game planning, and you really need to be careful about some like minor disadvantages or some minor advantages. You really want to capitalize on it. So after this, takes, and then just pinning his knight also, so he can't go to e4. Some may push like this. This is just not it. After this, you're just not scared. You could just give the bishop pair away, because this king side is weak. He can't castle, and he's still 1, 2, 3 pieces away from castling, and therefore his king is very exposed. You could go for some quick c file attack, bring the knight in, a bishop, just it's very dynamic. So just remember this queen c2, this classical variation is very handy. And therefore this leads me to the final thing, which is the King's Indian defense. So remember, the 3 pawns. You want to just keep the center. Your goal is to keep the center while he fights from the flanks. So after castle, I really like this h3 move. This just prevents this pin, and sometimes black likes to take it and then just questions about this pawn. This pawn is very weak, and the knight could sometimes hop into here because after this push, this just targets the queen. Whereas when after h3, the knight can't go here. I'll show you why. Because after d5, this knight is just very passive. Goes b4, a3 kicks it away. Goes to d5, this just voluntarily doubles his pawns. And therefore, black normally plays like knight bd7. And remember, the dark square bishop likes to go to d3. And no matter which pawn push, always go d5. There's c5, there's e5, always go d5. Always go d5. And then his knight may hop in. Don't give up the bishop here. You have to balance out his very strong dark square bishop, and just doubling his pawn is just not it in this situation. And therefore, you protect this pawn because it's double attacked. You double defend it. And then a very common idea. So after here, the bishop always goes to e2. You could see maybe there is a b4 here, but c takes e4. Oh yeah. After this, there is f5, and maybe people are seeing this strong, because I don't know, I have not studied this line. This line is crazy, therefore I always go for the solid bishop e2. And a very common idea is just bringing the knight back and preparing for f5. And oops. Therefore now you kick it because there is not 2 knights targeting this. Now you kick it away, and it's still saying f5 because it traps the bishop. Okay, so after f5, go for f3 because it gives your bishop breathing room, and this bishop is actually much stronger than this knight because this knight already has nowhere to go. A6 is just very passive. You go a3, and this pawn structure is very, very strong. And you are sacrificing some dark square weakness, but therefore you need to keep this bishop survive to protect these diagonals. And normally I perform better against the King's Indian because, as you can see, it's almost like a +1, and it's not really a recommended opening for black. And then there's Engloon Gambit, which I don't want to talk about. Just accept it, accept it and learn it. Maybe I'll put a video about the Engloon Gambit, but just learn that you need to accept it. At this level, you just need to learn some theory and you gotta accept it. As you can see, it's plus 1.1. And then there's this Horwitz defense, which would transpose after c4 into either a Nimzo Indian or a Queen's Gambit. And then this is basically, the Horwitz defense is basically the type of move for like the French defense players, which I talked about in the last video. But you don't need to worry about getting into the French defense with like c4. And then there's c6, which is for Carl Khan players. I won't play e4. I won't play into their repertoire. Just go for c4, go for the exchange Slav and play on. And there's one more opening I forgot to mention about. After this, with not e6 but c5 is the modern Benoni defense. After this, there's e6, which you protect with the knight, takes, and there is d6, and you push for e4, gaining advantage. The bishop normally goes to this diagonal, you just normally develop. And one main idea here is, after bishop pinning and castles, there is this knight d2 idea, which is always good, which after, let's say, after maybe, oh yeah, this is not, maybe normal developing moves like this, and then like h6, kicking my bishop, and then queen up, or just rook e8. Now you see why we need two defenders here. And we could just safely castle, and maybe he would expand on the queen side because he got the pawn majority. Something like a6, b5. Now, a very common idea is to play f3. But this doesn't work because this queenside expansion is too fast. Sometimes this is a main idea. After f3, you protect this pawn. This bishop drops back to defend this diagonal. And then there is a knight c4 idea, which if your bishop doesn't drop back here, you could also go to g3, and this is very strong. Just remember this idea. If the bishop fianchettos, you line up the bishop and knight. Knight always wants to go to c4, lines up and targets his pawn. And then another very common idea is knight a6, trying to reroute it back to c6, and after this, just, oh my, what is happening? Just bishop d3, if the knight hops in, bishop e2, now the computer is saying it's better. If knight hops in, just what is it doing here? And after castle, you just kick it away. Just question, what is it doing here? So therefore, people would go to c6, which pushing a4 just limits the square. And after rook e8, castles, and then a6, just tunnel vision on this. You could play for a very well-timed f3, or you could play for f4 and then just play for e5 and get these pawns rolling. So there is actually one more sideline I want to talk about, which is this Dutch defense. This is the final. I swear, this is the final one. So after c4 knight here, a very good system is this g3 Leningrad. And after g6 of fianchetto, or e6, you just fianchetto your bishop, develop your knight, castle, castle. Maybe sometimes there is a timed d5 push, but this backward pawn is just ugly, and therefore just a knight c3. And if he takes, queen a4 always just wins back the pawn. And therefore some people would play a knight e4, which is a very good outpost, which you would just like to trade it off. So after this bishop proves to be very strong, and just game goes on. Dutch is kind of very sideline-ish and very disturbing, but just remember this g3 line and bishop fianchetto is my preferred and recommended line. So this is all about mainly Queen's Gambit and a d4 repertoire of my white pieces, and it is very handy and very solid, very positional for the intermediate level, and is also very often played in the higher advanced level. I hope you enjoyed today's content. I hope you learned something in today's video, and subscribe for more chess content, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.